3 things to avoid a mental health crisis.
If you can look after yourself, then you can look after everything else in your life. And so many times we put everyone else before us. But say, what have I actually done for myself today? The second thing I would say is actually try and look at your day, try and drink more water, try and add 1 to 2 new plant foods within your week, really looking at like the quality of the food that you're eating. So I think one thing that I really want to highlight, and I think that I'm really passionate about, is you think you're unsmart, you think you're
something
different.
is wrong with you.
Something is wrong. I remember one of my teachers, who was my psychology teacher, said, "You're never going to be anything." She was the person who really gave me kind of that confidence to be like, no, I am going to do this and I'm going to figure it out. And I got the top grade in the country for psychology after that. I suffered with such bad loneliness. Took some Nurofen, didn't get better, getting worse. Took some more Nurofen, A pat later took some more Nurofen. Had basically like a full body seizure. Was rushed into intensive care and was in there for months.
I didn't know this.
And my phone kept ringing and it kept ringing and it kept ringing and it kept ringing. And I was like, why is my mum calling me constantly? Mum, stop calling me. She was like, your father's in hospital. And in that moment, I was like, I'm going to lose somebody who is one of the most important people in my life. Get me out. And I lost my agent when I left. Bodies are like physically saying no, and we're just ignoring every body sensation. Mental health isn't a disease, and it's not a diagnosis that you're mentally unstable. Mental health is something where it's an organ within our brains, and anytime we have stress in it, is a highlight that our mental health needs to be looked at. One of the biggest things that hopefully people might take from this podcast is...
Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome back to the Intelligent Change podcast. Today, I have my dear friend, Sarah Ann Macklin, who, how do I even introduce you? There's so many things I want to say about you. First of all, is an incredible soul. Your energy is always so radiant, and I just love being around you. Also, you're a mental health activist, a podcast host, a fashion model. And, there's so many things that I find inspiring about you. And I really would love to dive deeper into your story of your intelligent change, of how you went from being a fashion model who had incredible opportunities in the fashion industry and transitioning into becoming a nutritionist, learning about the body, and also creating this incredible organization that you have, about living well and being well, and creating that awareness about not only physical health, but also mental health. So I'd really love to dive into that today with you. Thank you so much for being here today with me.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you to do my PR from going forward. Thank you for introducing me so beautifully. And just vice versa, like honestly, I know we met properly earlier this year, and since we've met, your energy has just been amazing to be around you and Alex.
Thank you.
And I know I'm not the only one to say that, even this week when you hosted a beautiful Intelligent Change dinner, and the energy in that room. So you both have an incredible superpower for that. So I feel very grateful to
You're so kind.
be here and be with you. And I know everyone who's listening will also be feeling that energy too. So thank you for that kind introduction.
Let's go back to your childhood, because I feel like so much of who we are today comes from certain adversities we face. Or maybe comforts as well, because too much comfort can also be an adversity. But I know that's not really part of your story. Can you tell me a little bit about, where you were raised and your upbringing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting thing as you get older and you start looking back on your life, and you're like, wow, okay, I can start really seeing where all of this started. So I had, a very just normal and happy childhood. I grew up just outside a place called Portsmouth, which is in Hampshire, and we went to a normal school, had 2 parents, very hardworking, immense amount of love. A brother and a sister, and I was the youngest, which I always think is quite interesting when you figure out who's the oldest in the family and who's the youngest. And I was a very confident child. My mum said that the moment I came out, my eyes were open and then they didn't shut. And that's probably how I would describe me as a kid. Very smiley and interactive, loved being around people. And then I feel that when I got to secondary school, things started to change a little bit. And I think I started to lose my confidence a little bit. I went to just a normal state school. So I think in those moments when there's a lot of children in a class, if you're relatively quite good, you kind of just get forgotten about. And I would just say I was just a normal good kid, didn't cause, any disruption. But as I started to develop, I started to just feel very different to others. But you can't really express yourself when you're younger because it's very hard to understand your emotions, and especially when you're going through puberty and all of these other things, especially as a woman. And so I think I just felt quite slow, but I was insanely hardworking, so I would just mask it. And I've definitely got a perfectionist type to me anyway. So I would just go home and work exceptionally hard and then just pretend, I just knew that instantly. So I felt this overwhelming pressure to do really well because I just felt like I was always left behind. And that then went into my A-levels, which was around 16, 17. And I remember if like a spelling test came up or anything like that, I was just terrified. And I started to like really lose my confidence. I started to not be able to speak out in class. I started to kind of try and hide myself away from those moments. And it's because I never knew I was dyslexic. And I remember...
I'm so glad you're bringing this up because I actually have a couple of questions about
really,
this.
yeah. And it's like, this is going back like 20 years ago nearly. And I think back then, anything around like neurodiversity, like you look at kids that really acted out, it wasn't because they were bad kids, it's because they had ADHD. And I know a lot of this is kind of coming to the forefront now, but I think back then it just wasn't recognized. So I basically grew up thinking I was very slow, quite unintelligent, and just very different. And I think that basically destroyed a lot of my aspirations and dreams. So when people go, what would you want to do? I wouldn't think the bigger picture because I would be like, well, that's so far out of reach, I'm not going to be able to touch it. And then when I was 16, I went to a music festival and I had a tap on my shoulder. And a lot of agents from London had come down. So Kate Moss's agent had come down, Elizabeth Hurley's agent had come down, and they all said, we're from, Storm or Models One or Select, and they're all different modelling agencies in London, and, we're scouts. Have you ever thought of being a model? And I was like, absolutely not. I came from this tiny town where these things just didn't happen. And I always remember that phrase my parents were like, don't speak to strangers, and it was the first time I went out with my girlfriends when I was 16 to this music festival. So I basically got these cards and didn't really think about it and thought they're probably not from London, they're probably not model agents. And I got home and showed my mum, and she was like, oh. And obviously they were real. So my life kind of changed course, and I signed to them. And I remember one of my first castings was with Henry Holland. He was just starting his designs back then, and got that job straight away with Henry, and he was my first ever stylist. And that was a really cool moment. And I kept going to school when I remember one of my teachers, who was my psychology teacher, said, you're never going to be anything. And you think modelling is a way out.
I can't believe a teacher would say that to a student.
It was quite like this. Wow. And I remember...
how discouraging.
When you're 16 as well. And I just remember coming home and bursting into tears and saying, I'm never going to be anything. And my mum said, no, that's not true. And I said, you know what? It's not true. And I actually have to thank her, because that was the moment when I didn't know I was dyslexic, didn't know I had these kind of, and I don't want to say disabilities, like these different ways of thinking, that I just then turned to my mum and said, and I remember so clearly, go and get me loads of A3 sheets of white paper, get me every single colour of pen you can imagine. And I remember reciting over 1,000 studies in psychology, because you have to remember all the dates and the names, and that's the hardest thing as a dyslexic, is your memory with words, and colour coding everything. And all of a sudden going, I'm going to find a solution to why this is so difficult. And that was my turning point. And I remember going in every day, and she moved me tutors. I mean, she was a really hard piece of work, but I was so determined to prove her wrong. And she was the person who really gave me kind of that confidence to be like, no, I am going to do this, and I'm going to figure it out. And I got the top grade in the country for psychology after that. So it went from not being able to learn. So you like a good challenge, yeah? I literally got a good challenge. And it's because I was like, I'm not going to be defeated, and I know I can do this, but what's my way of learning? Colours was, mind maps, all of that kind of stuff. And then I went into modelling, and then obviously I came back later to do my university degree.
Before we go more into your modelling career, because obviously I want to talk a lot about that as well,
yeah.
because there's so many things we can uncover there. I just want to pause a little and talk about dyslexia, because I'm convinced I'm dyslexic. I've never
Really?
been diagnosed, but listening to you, it's like very reaffirming, because I've had the same struggle and issue. First of all, I cannot follow directions.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that dyslexics struggle with. Or if I'm in a yoga class or a dance class, everybody's going one way, I'm going this way.
Yeah.
If I have to put furniture together and I just look at the instructions or even simple recipe books, I look at it and I'm already overwhelmed. I'm like, I'll just close the book and I'll do it my way. You know, and even though I've never been diagnosed, I've struggled with this as well in school and in life. And what I've learned to do, similar, I guess, to you, is look at this adversity as my super talent.
Yeah, it is. It's a
You know,
superpower.
you can label yourself as somebody with this diagnosis that is preventing you from ABC, or you can say, hey, actually, yes, I don't think like everybody else or operate like everybody else, but in fact, this gives me this superpower to do things differently, which I think in my case, and probably similar to you, we think differently, and that allows us to, if we act on, of course, these thoughts or these ideas, create new opportunities for ourselves and create a potential business, or, you know, other people don't have this gift that we have. So I think dyslexia is a little bit misunderstood. I think it can be a gift.
It is a complete gift. And I've started to I know you're so good at positive affirmations. And I've started to, in the last kind of few years, really start to relook at how I use the terminology around dyslexia. So I don't use the word diagnose. I don't use the word, anything that's kind of, I always use the word blessed with dyslexia, or kind of use it as my superpowers, and these are my strengths. And I think it's a really odd thing, because you're kind of put into this system of learning when you're very young, and if you don't fit into that one linear system, then you're an anomaly and there's something wrong with you. And I think we're starting to try and change that, but still in the schooling system it's very different. And I think there needs to be a much open conversation, because the things with dyslexics is there's so many different types of dyslexia. And reading and spelling is one, but one is around emotions, a lot of it is around organization, timekeeping, but there's so many other strengths to dyslexia, and it's like that bigger picture thinking. And I think, like, looking at you, like, look at what you've created.
The bigger picture thinking,
right?
for sure.
And it's like, it's amazing. And you kind of look at things in a different way, in a bigger lens. And I think every company needs to have those types of brains, because if we're all that one linear thinking, you know, then it would be a very boring world, but we wouldn't kind of solve bigger problems. And if you look at what dyslexics are really good at, it's entrepreneurship, it's engineering, it's the arts. These are the things that people are meant to be going into. But the sad thing is, it's something like half prisons, juvenile prisons in America, are full of people with dyslexics, because the problem is at school, and this is where it all starts, you think you're unsmart, you think you're
something
different.
is wrong with you.
Something is wrong. And you also feel like, because it's out of touch, because it's out of reach, basically. And that's the thing, if you can't see it and you can't grasp it, you could get somewhere, then you never actually aim to get there. And so when you're at school, you feel very disheartened, because you maybe are slower at processing, or your memory. You actually like, well, why am I so different? So you actually just kind of behave quite badly and get into gangs, and you kind of think, well, this is achievable, I can kind of stay in this sector of a group. And you actually, sadly, many times can go down the wrong path. And I think that's where a lot of work needs to be done, is like actually more people that speak out about this. And I've only done it recently, like even talking about this is it's still like a journey for me, because I felt very stigmatized for so long. And I interviewed Shane Parrish the other week, who is somebody I've looked up to. And he is like the man of mental models. And I thought, God, our brains are so different. You know, he's so logical, and he's done all of these incredible ways of thinking and learning. And, you know, I find it really inspirational. I found out he was dyslexic on the podcast.
There you go.
And it's those moments when you're like, when you know that people are your heroes, or that you look up to, actually speak about this, you know, like Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, Keira Knightley, all of these people. Apparently Einstein was dyslexic. But, you know, when you think about people like that, and you'll go, if more people speak about it, it's actually not stigmatized. And it's just learning your own groove. And even if you're not neurodiverse in any sector, and I think we're all slightly neurodiverse, everyone has different ways of learning. and different ways of being and different ways of reacting to emotions. And I think it's just about understanding more about yourself. And then as you do, and you speak up so well, like just being comfortable with it and being grateful for it. And I would say, like, whether you're neurodiverse or not, understanding what your own strengths are and what your own weaknesses are is like the best thing for self-growth, because basically all your weaknesses, you know, don't focus on them, focus on your strengths. And that's actually when you see so much more growth.
So true. I think it's like we're all the narrators of our story. Are we going to choose to be the victim of the situation, or are we going to see it as a superpower?
Yeah.
Now, going back again to your journey, being scouted into a modeling agency, some of these top modeling agencies, and having all these opportunities. Now you're 16, 17, you're starting to travel. How did that feel?
So that was a really interesting...
Because it sounds like a dream, right? Like for a teenager.
It sounds like so it's really interesting. So 16 to 18 was a really strange age. So I remember going home to my parents and saying, you know, this has happened. And they took me up to see the agencies. I got scouted. But my mum was like, right, two things. You're finishing your A-levels because I want you to go to university at some point if you want to. I want you guys to have that option.
Absolutely.
You don't have to go. And in my head, I was thinking, I hate school. You know, I was never the lover of school. I obviously really struggled. So I was like, just get me out of school as quick as possible. And secondly, and she said, you know, it's really important that until you're kind of 18, you are still at home in a sense. So I would fly, but my mum would fly with me, and she would only let me do it in term time or at weekends and things like that. The other thing she said to me is, I still want you to have your Saturday and Sunday job. So unless you're modeling, so unless you're going off to shoot, there's a clothing store, I don't even know if it's still around now, and it's a men's clothing store, and I only worked there because you could get discount at Topshop. So I remember having to go Saturday and Sunday for my 4 hours each week, earning my £2.10 an hour.
£2.
That was minimum wage back then.
That's
I know
insane.
that I used to live on that. And that was all the money that I used to earn when I was between 16 and 17. So I used to earn something like, I don't know, £25 a week or something. And I used to be like, my one Friday night out, a cab into town, a couple of drinks, £1 for a cloakroom, and then a cab home. And at the same time, I was earning a lot of money, but I didn't know what I was earning. So it would go into a bank account. My mum never told me. And I think that was a real blessing that my mum gave me. So I was kind of on these amazing sets, shooting for people like Burberry and like Henry Holland and Matthew Williamson, but then going to do my day job and also go back to school. And then when I was 18, my mum said...
She knew if you knew, you would never go
if
do the
I
£2
knew,
job.
I would never have done that. But it basically taught me this massive value of money. Like I remember having driving lessons and being like, how much do I have to work to buy a car? And it really taught me these values. Whereas if she just kind of said, oh, you know, you're earning this much an hour or this much in a day, I would have been... absolutely not had my head on my shoulders because I was 16. And so when I was 18, she kind of said, look, this is your bank account, and if you want to go to London, you know, we're not going to support you. We'll support you emotionally and we'll, with everything you want to do, but we're not going to financially support that. So it's up to you to do this. And I was like, okay. And so I realized how much I'd been earning, mapped out how long I could live in London. And then that was it. I think within the first 3 days of coming to London, which was 3 days after my last exam, I was like, right, that's it. I'm finding a place. I was flying. I was really lucky. I was just flying all over the world. I lived in Paris for a bit, lived in Milan for a bit, and then I like kind of really settled down in New York. And part of it is insanely fun, as you can tell, like being that young and traveling the world just opens your eyes to opportunities, especially when you haven't grown up in that world. And that's where my confidence started to come out. So I started to feel a bit more confident because all of a sudden I was kind of being praised and acknowledged for something, and where for years in school I wasn't. But then on the other side there was a lot of pressure.
I can imagine,
a lot of rejection as well. So although I was getting chosen for a lot of different campaigns and recognized, I was also getting turned away a lot. And then all of a sudden, you know, comments like, you know, are you going to the gym? What are you eating? You know, this person wants to see you. What shape are you in? And obviously being terrified of things like your period coming or feeling bloated because you just didn't want to have any imperfections. And, you know, after a year of intensity of the modeling industry, you know what every single part of your body looks like from every single angle, which is just not normal,
especially at that age.
At that age,
such a critical age,
it's
right?
Such a critical age. And the biggest thing that I noticed is that there was just this massive disconnect from community. So you're in a hotel room on your own every single night. you don't make any strong friendships because you're just not around for long enough. So when all my friends were kind of going to these really awesome universities and starting to build their own big group network of friends that have lasted them a lifetime, I was in this fragmented community with an insane lens of perfection on me. And so as well as my confidence was starting to grow in certain areas, going, oh, wow, maybe I am good at something. Maybe this is a good kind of opportunity for me. The other side was kind of like, this could go at any moment. And also, I remember I had 12 rejections last week. In 1 week, that's quite a lot for an 18-year-old. You know, and so you would be on this trajectory of highs and lows, ups and downs. Is this going to be taken away from me at any moment? And so I think on top of that, you're also running a business, like you're also self-employed as a model. And so I was kind of getting all my head around that. So I think, you know, there was like a very big conflict within inside myself. And as a model, you're not human. You know, you're not as, you know, for you who grew as a personality around who you are. Whereas for me, I was just this character. I was just morphed into different characters
Whatever
every
you
day.
Needed to be for
whatever I
shoot
needed to
or,
be. No one knew who I was. No one asked who I was. And what I kind of slowly started to realize is as soon as you're not flavor of the month anymore, that's it, you're gone. And I think I started to build certain friendships or started to see girls a lot more because they were modeling as much as me. And then all in a minute they'd be gone. And they'd left and they'd have gone from New York and you'd be like, oh, I'm here on my own again. And so it's that constant feeling. I suffered with such bad loneliness. I suffered with really bad insecurities around how I looked, how I acted, how I was perceived. And so although they were some of probably my most successful years, I put so much onto that actually I kind of had put all my eggs in one basket. And so if that was taken away with me, I think I would have had I did basically have a mental breakdown.
Was that your breaking point?
My breaking point was, I think, my breaking point was in New York. And I remember shooting for American Vintage, which was it's a big Parisian fashion label. And I got to set, and I think I'd been under so much chronic stress within myself, and I had been flying constantly, but I'd also think I'd started to realize like the full force of what I've been doing for such a long time, and I hadn't looked after my body, I hadn't been eating well, I hadn't slept, I'd been on this overdrive of cortisol for such an intense time, and I collapsed the moment I got off that set. I remember waking up in the morning and going in and going, I really don't feel well. But if you don't work as a model, you don't get paid. And also, if you don't turn up on set, you've got 50 people waiting for you. So you just have this immense pressure where you're like, I can't take a day off. So I remember getting onto set and I took some Nurofen. Also, this is not advisable, by the way, what I'm about to say. Took some Nurofen, didn't get better, was getting worse. Took some more Nurofen, took some more Nurofen. A pat later, took some more Nurofen. And then basically got dropped down when I got home and had basically like a full body seizure. Was rushed into intensive care and was in there for months. My whole body had physically shut down.
How old were you then?
23. I had internal bleeding through my whole body, which turned into septicemia. My kidney wasn't working.
Oh my goodness.
I had 5 birth cysts, ovarian cysts. I was riddled with E. coli. They were sending helicopters down from Scotland because there was only one antibiotic that could treat me. And I was in a really bad way, like intensive care, like, you know, it was very bad for a very long time.
I didn't know this. Wow, that's crazy.
It was
at 23.
Just over 5 stone, which was tiny for my height as well.
So do you think your lifestyle as a model led you to being in this physical health at that moment in your life?
I think it was an amalgamation of things. I think I was, for years, unconfident in who I was because I was told, not from my parents, but from the schooling system and from feeling around peers, not good enough. And then I got into the modeling world where all of a sudden I weirdly had felt good enough, but then was kind of knew I was building this resilience. Then I was rejected constantly as well at the same time. And then I was in a bubble where I wanted to try and be the best. And I put so much intense pressure on myself. And, you know, wasn't eating, but I was never told either. I was never gone to see a nutritionist. I didn't have any help on to how to look after myself. And you're so young. And the fear that this could all be taken away at any moment and the intense pressure of it. So I think it was a massive amalgamation of things. And I think at that moment, like my whole body I just hadn't been looking after it. And that's why I'm so passionate today around preventative sides.
It makes sense why.
And I also, after that, came up with so many different autoimmune conditions that will never leave, you know, because of what I went through. And I think the hard thing was, I remember people coming to see me and being shocked just at kind of how fragile I was. And 6 months later, I went back to New York. And I still hadn't. That wasn't my turning point.
I know, because that was at 25, which was more of a mental.
Yeah. I went back to New York because I was told that I was the right weight. By the way, I told you how thin I was. The right weight for certain brands out there. So I went out, and I remember cycling around Central Park with one of my friends who told me she was leaving New York because she couldn't deal with the pressure. And my phone kept ringing, and it kept ringing, and it kept ringing, and it kept ringing. And I was like, oh my God, why is my mum calling me constantly? And so I answered my phone going, Mum, stop calling me. And she was like, your father's in hospital. And when you're on the other side of the world, you're like, okay, he's had a brain hemorrhage. We don't know if he's going to make it. And I remember going, I have to get home. And it was only 6 months previous that I was in that, not having a brain hemorrhage, but my body shutting down. And I'm insanely close to my dad, but what I realized is in those last 5 years of being in New York, I had not spent time or been present with my family. And it was that moment where I was like, my dad's going to go. And I'm not there, and I haven't been there. And I remember calling my agent and kind of saying, and then this isn't London at all, this was in New York, saying, I need to get home, I need to get on a flight. And they were like, well, you've got a massive job tomorrow, you've just signed a contract, you can't go. And it's that moment that I realized where I'd been putting success. And success for me was put on money, fame, social status, this whole thing that is what the Oxford Dictionary says. What is success is fame, wealth, and social status. And that is how I drove my mind to believe. And in that moment, I was like, I'm going to lose someone who is one of the most important people in my life. Get me out. And I lost my agent when I left. I was dropped. And it just shows you how fickle some things can be. And I spent time on that plane, sat there thinking it was only 6 months ago that my body was in this state. Now my father's in that state. And my whole balance of life had just completely spiraled out of control. I had no reflection of where I was, who I was, what was important to me. Because actually I realized in that moment that was important to me, and it hadn't been one of my priorities. So when I got back and I saw my dad, and he was in a bad state for 2.5 years after that, and it changed who he was as a person. I remember the doctor saying, your dad has had a brain hemorrhage and a bleed in his brain because of stress. And I just remember in that moment going, oh my God, that, my body went through that because of stress, not a brain hemorrhage, but a full body shutdown. And I was just like, our nation is driven towards not looking after their health.
This is how detrimental stress can be. And I still feel like people don't talk enough about it.
They don't.
Because
until
it's like,
too
oh,
late.
well, we're all stressed and, that's just part of life. Well, but how do we manage stress?
Exactly.
I think that's the conversation we should all be
how
having.
do we prevent it?
And why are we stressed in the first place?
Right?
Because maybe you're not doing the right thing.
And this is
you
the
shouldn't
thing.
be this stressed. I mean,
it's like we don't need that wake-up call when it's that bad, We should kind of be more aware that we're pushing, our bodies are physically saying no, and we're just ignoring every body sensation. And that's what I did, that's what my dad did. And that's when I had my whole
what a
pivot.
wake-up call. I mean, not once but twice.
Not once but twice. And it's not until you really realize that you're going to lose something so close to you, even after it's detriment to yourself, that you're like, wait. And that's when my kind of whole career changed. And that's been kind of now the next journey for the last however many years. So
how did you redefine your definition of success? Going from the money, success, fame to what is it now for you? I guess with what you're doing now and everything you have learned now in the past, 12 years probably, more or less.
It's such a good question, because I've taken a year to kind of really think about this on, because I think when you're going through a journey, you still don't really know you're going through that journey. You're still understanding who you are. And so, for me, the first step after that, I remember sitting there, and it's such a hard thing to kind of go, I'm going to walk away from something. And loads of my agents were like, you should go back to New York. And I was like, this does not feel right.
Yep.
And it's not that I don't like the modeling world. Like I'm still in the world here in Europe and in London, and it's changed massively, and I've changed. So it's a different mentality for me now. But I took a big break and I went back to university, which, by the way, when you're not, I wasn't told I was dyslexic at this point. So all of a sudden I was going back to learn about biochemistry and nutrition, where, by the way, I was not good at science. It's not like I was like thriving in that area. And I remember going back to school and saying to my mum, okay, the first stuff I'm going to do is go and learn about nutrition so I can understand just how to look after myself. My mum was like, I'm always your biggest supporter. I really don't know if this is a good idea, because I'd struggled so much. And I was like, wait, you're always supportive. Why would you say that? And I think she saw the stress of me at school. Yeah. And I went to school, I enrolled, I got through, came back to London, did my nutrition degree. Within 6 weeks, had a full breakdown again. I just remember sitting in class and going, this feels like Japanese. And I was going, where do I fit in society? Where is my gift? Like, don't seem to be good at, anything to do with school. And my teacher at that point, called me in and said, you're not stupid. It's the first time a teacher said that to me. Amazing. You're not stupid. She was amazing. Yeah. And she said, I just want to ask you a question, because I went in to say, I'm quitting. I can't do this after 6 weeks. I said, have you ever been tested for dyslexia? And I just remember being like 24, 25 and going, no. Why? Like, why would you ask me that in my mid-20s? She said, could you just do the test for me? So 2.5
I need to do this test.
2.5 hours later, I go in to do this test. And within the first 2 minutes, they said, look, we're going to put you through. It's like a 3-hour process, but I just want you to know that you are very dyslexic. And I just remember for the first time going, am I? And she explained to me how a dyslexic's mind works. And this, like, huge amount of emotion just came all the way over me. And it's like the first time in like 25 years that someone had gone, this is how your brain works, because I didn't even understand it.
Like, you felt seen probably for the first time.
But I also understood my brain, because I didn't think I understood even how my brain worked. I just was so frustrated with it all the time that I would just switch it off. And it was the first time she talked me through, even like going to the supermarket and how I looked at buying produce. She said,
so what is the biggest difference? I'm curious.
So myself. She said, I'm going to give you a really simple explanation. She said, right, a normal kind of undyslexic brain will go in and they need to cook a spaghetti bolognese. They'll go in, they'll buy the spaghetti, they'll buy the meat, they'll buy the pasta sauce, they'll buy an onion, they'll buy garlic, and they'll check out. Yeah. Quick, simple, out. You'll go in and you'll go, okay, I want a pasta. Do I have this pasta? Do I have that pasta? If I make the tomato sauce, maybe I'll make the tomato sauce. How would I make the tomato sauce? Maybe I'll make the tomato. And my brain just goes off in so many different directions. And she's like, by the end of it, you're so overwhelmed. You forgot what you started with, but your brain has kind of gone off into a different spiral. So she said, in learning,
all the options,
which she said is amazing when you're not in the schooling system, because your brain will work in a very creative process. When you're in school and you've got to learn very logically, you need to learn X equals Y, and you can't learn like that. So I had become like so frustrated in the process of structure. But it's just even how she explained that simple shopping market, and I was like, I didn't even realize I did that, and that's what I do, and that's why I get overwhelmed. So I have to write very simple lists now when I go and just do the lists and not stick off it.
Stick to the list.
Stick to the list, and that's why routine's really important for me. All these kind of things that I've now implemented. Anyway, so that's how I started on that side.
Makes so much sense.
And so, like, to get back to your kind of definition of success, I kind of, from that, I went into wanting to help a lot more people with their mental health, because I realized through my own learning of nutrition that mental health and food were insanely connected. And there was a lot of things, even around the food side of things, that could really help with neurodiversity and dyslexia. And that's what I based my whole dissertation on. And from there, my interest in mental health grew further, and I wanted to understand about eating disorders and eating behaviors, and then more about the gut microbiome. And then this whole world just like opened up, and I was like, how have I never known the power behind this, the power of mental health, like how these are interconnected. And this is also was when mental health and nutrition weren't spoken about. And now it's very much on the periphery of minds and conversations, which is incredible. But when I was studying it, it wasn't. So it was kind of like, oh my gosh. And I just remember sitting in the library and reading journals and reading papers. And all of a sudden I was like, how does no one know about this? So I really wanted to shed the light on the interconnection between these two things, and also around prevention, because I was like, I don't want anyone to go through what I went through. And if I can help by giving this information out that's also accurate, because I was also kind of driven into a world in America where it was very, very, very heavy in misinformation.
Yeah.
And I was listening to the wrong voices, the wrong people. And I think that's part of what drove me into kind of a very bad way of looking at food. So that was my sole mission. And it started in fashion, and then it just kind of exploded outside of that industry. And that is, when I look at success, for me, it starts with self-care. So for me, success is like being able to look after yourself and putting yourself first. And it's not about just having a bath or just going for a run. It's
which
about,
is still nice.
which is really nice, right? But we kind of look at these moments where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, self-care is booking a spa day.
No.
That's not self-care. That's like a luxury that we can look forward to, and that's something that we can have in our lives. But self-care is daily moments that bring you joy and that give you 5 minutes, whatever that is. And that can be so small. That can be something where it's like making yourself a couple of times a tea a day and actually doing some breathing exercises. It could be just calling a friend. For me, it's calling my family and checking in, spending time with my dog, Harry, or my brother's dog, but kind of call him mine now, and having those daily moments that are for me. And I think when you have that, then you are way more connected to yourself and better for work and better for others. So that's the first thing I would describe, and I'm really passionate about self-care. The second is giving back. And funny enough, when I started my not-for-profit organization, the Be Well Collective, the more I started learning about giving back and actually how good it was making me feel, I was like, it's actually it's one of the most selfish things we can do, because it actually gives you a huge abundance of joy to give back to others, and we forget that. So for me, actually being able to create an organization where we helped over 10,000 people with mental health and mentoring and events and workshops and kind of sustainable tools for them to go forward in life from a young age has kind of been a real big driver for me in success. And that's how I would look at my scale of success. And lastly, I'm trying to think of 3 things. It was fame, wealth, and social status. Human connection is probably the other way that I would define success. And I think
that.
Building a podcast is an amazing way for me to get human connection to others.
That's how we
different
met.
That's how we met, right? And
By being on your podcast.
by being on coming to Intelligent Change as well, the Incredible Summit. But I think for so long I was fragmented and I wasn't in a community. I was always traveling and always on my own. And it's something that inherently we know from studies, like just not from my own anecdotal evidence, but from studies that, all studies on longevity, which is a big thing now. Kind of the longest study ever done was on people that were from Brooklyn, and they actually found the people that lived the longest were the people that were in communities and in strong partnerships and were surrounded by people that felt that they were very loved and looked after. And it's not just about being with your partner, it's about being in a community.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think if you have those things where you look after yourself, you're giving back, but you've also got a really strong sense of community, I think like that's how I would define success, because they bring so many elements of joy to oneself and to others. And for me, that kind of is how I would now define success.
I absolutely love that. What a transformation, right? Not only on the physical level, because ultimately, you heal the body and you heal the mind, or maybe you heal the mind and the body heals, because I think ultimately the body gives us the signal of what is happening emotionally, and we can only ignore it for so long until it gets to the point where you can no longer ignore it. You end up in a hospital, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is such an important message to stress, and for people not to disregard the misaligned feeling, because I think it always starts with a bit of an intuition, that inkling that you're not in the right place, but you ignore it, and then you ignore it, then you might get headaches, or you might get like stomach aches, or and then you keep ignoring it, back pains, and then you keep ignoring it enough, it's going to manifest in a physical illness, and then you can no longer ignore it. You have to address it. So I think for anybody listening now, I think maybe a good question to ask is that how does what you do or your environment right now makes you feel? Does it energize you? Does it bring you joy? Do you feel aligned with what you're doing in life? And if not, what can you do to maybe slowly but surely put you on that path of alignment? Because
Totally.
I think it's so beautiful to see that life doesn't have to be perfect. You have to start your journey somewhere. But if you're not on the right track, it's always okay to, change your
Always.
path. And if you didn't do what you did, you wouldn't be on this path, right?
No, if I didn't have all those awful times, and they were awful, like I don't want to sit here and go, oh, she's got it all figured out. Like it's a complete journey. And I would say like those questions that you just mentioned to ask, if people go, okay, but I don't know what the answer to them is, or I don't know, like I didn't know what they were. And when you tell a story, it can also feel like, oh, there was this really kind of like clear path journey, but it wasn't. It was like 8 years of total navigation, crying, not understanding. And it's only now when I look back and reflect on those moments, I go, oh, that was the path, but it wasn't a clear direction. And I think, don't be afraid of not knowing the answers. I think that's the power. Because if we all knew the answers, we'd be doing it anyway. So it's actually, rather than kind of saying, oh, I don't know what it is, and panicking, just being like, I don't know what it is right now, but I really want to learn, and I'm going to
setting that intention.
Keep asking these questions, because what we can do is just disconnect when we feel uncomfortable around what we feel fear around. And it's something that I was great at doing for many years, and it's why my body got to such a bad state, because I just disconnected from myself. I just decided to completely ignore every single signal. Every time I thought, when I had that first hospitalization, I obviously thought, well, this is not great. But I decided to ignore it. Yeah. And rather than go, why? And I'm not sure why, but let's try and figure it out. Maybe let's have some more therapy, or let's talk to someone. I decided to pretend that I had everything together. And I didn't. And there's this like huge fear of being like, actually, I'm not okay. Like, it's really hard to say that. And I don't know why. That's also really hard to say. But like leaning into that is where this like insane amount of discomfort comes, but an amazing amount of growth, which you won't know at the time is happening. But you'll look back a few years later and go, oh yeah, that was the moment.
Yep. I always like to say life makes sense backwards. And people are like, what do you mean? Because it doesn't make sense in the moment. And you're like, why the F is this happening to me? Well, just be patient, surrender, let go, go with the process, but it will all make sense at one point.
Yeah, totally. And I always kind of think, I felt like I was fighting against the tide for so long. I remember studying nutrition, and when I went to do it, everyone was like, why would you study that? I remember my grandma, bless her heart, she's not here anymore, but I remember sitting across from her saying, I'm going to go and study nutritional science. And she was like, what is that? And she was like, is that when you tell people what to eat? And I was like, well, it's kind of a mix of like biochemistry and, trying to talk to her. She just couldn't. She was from a generation where this just didn't exist. Like this type of terminology just wasn't around. And I really felt like I was going against the grain, like even talking about this, and then trying to talk about mental health, even in family discussions, was just was a no-go. And trying to talk about this into my industry or kind of on my platforms, it was so uncomfortable because everybody felt quite uncomfortable around it. And it's not until COVID hit where people started cooking more at home, or started to go, wait, I feel very disconnected. I'm not going to work. I'm not seeing my friends. I can't see my family. And I basically felt like I had a bit of PTSD in that moment, because it felt like I went back to my modeling days where I was so disconnected from everyone. And all of a sudden, everyone started to realize like mental health isn't a disease, and it's not a diagnosis that you're mentally unstable. Mental health is something where it's an organ within our brains, and anytime we have stress in it, is a highlight that our mental health needs to be looked at. And so all of a sudden the conversation kind of started to come to the forefront, and that is the one thing that was a blessing from COVID, that everybody started to kind of ignite, like connect to themselves and go, wait, maybe I need to be more aware of this, or I really need to be aware of human connection, because we started to become very disconnected from our phones. And and I remember going back to in-person meetings, and everyone was like, it's so good to see a person in face. Because we were like so sick
the little things in life, right?
It was like the little things in life, and just like literally going for a walk with a friend, or having a coffee, or I've never been so excited to put an in-person meeting in my diary in my life. Whereas now I'm like, oh, got too many. But like back in that moment, it was
the contrast,
I really craved. And I think that was a real turning point just for mental health awareness in general, and especially around nutrition. And I kind of think like one of the biggest things that hopefully people might take from this podcast is around kind of prevention and action around their health.
That's actually what I want to ask you. If I know it's a big question, but in a way, in summary, if you were to tell someone 3 things to do to avoid a mental health crisis, what would these 3 things be?
So I would say, wow, I think it really depends what that person is. And I think one thing that and I definitely will say 3 things, but I think one thing that I really want to highlight, and I think that I'm really passionate about, is how we're so individualized, we're so unique. And I'm also really careful about giving out specific health advice, only because if I feel like I share too much about things that are so important to me and they don't work for somebody else, and people feel very disheartened.
It's a great point.
And so something that's really important is that, like, anything that you hear from anyone, if it doesn't feel right for you, then that is also totally normal. So I'd probably say, like, the first thing around mental health is, do you have anyone to speak to? And I think that's something that's really important, because through my own journey, I just basically thought I had everything together all the time. I also felt a huge burden to talk to anybody about it, and I thought, well, you know, I see my friends, why would they want me to complain when I see them? Or, you know, if I tell my parents, they're only going to worry and they won't understand. And so you go through these moments of, and I was also terrified of seeing a therapist, because in England, 10 years ago, if you saw a therapist, you had something severely wrong with you. And so I had this, like, horrible
We've come a long
image,
way, image
in my head that I was like, well, if I see a therapist, there's obviously
now everybody
really
has
wrong
a
with
therapist.
And then I went to New York, and I remember sitting around the table going, who's your therapist? Who's your therapist? Who's your therapist? And I was saying, I felt so alien. I was like, God,
why does everybody have
I feel so uncomfortable. And now I'm like, God, that's so sad that I felt like that. You know, and I've had a therapist since I was 20, and I still make sure I see a therapist, because it doesn't mean I've got something wrong with me. It means I've got an amazing outlet to reflect and think about my week, and to bring up any problems with somebody who's completely neutral in that situation. And we all need that. We all need somebody to offload to, because we are machines, and we carry emotions. And if we don't let go of those emotions, or let that flow through us, or become aware of them, they basically manifest within us, whether it's in a physical disease or heavy anxiety, because we suppress. So I would say the first thing is to make someone you can speak to. It doesn't have to be a therapist, because it can be really, really expensive, and they're not very accessible to everybody. But it's having a friend, having a mentor, or even having a way that you can have an outlet to speak, whether that could even be in a community setting, and you go to a social setting once a week.
I love that.
that's,
Can I
like,
just
really
add something to that? Because I on my personal journey, I've recently have been a bit more outspoken about what I'm going through with my friend circle. Usually I'm the one who holds it together and listens to others, and somehow I'm like stepping into my feminine, and I'm like, I am going through something, and I'm going to share with you. And I think the most beautiful thing that comes out of it, sometimes people assume if you are putting this persona of being the strong person, they think you're always perfect, everything's perfect with you, and they want to see that you're a human being and you can be vulnerable, and like shit can go down in your life too. And I feel like it's been healing for my friends to like see that vulnerable side of me, and they're like, oh, I love that you've shared this with me, and now they can be there for me. And it's just been so good for our friendship. I recommend for anyone who is like myself, you know, is used to kind of keeping it all inside and figuring it out all on their own. You don't have to be the strong one. Like, there's no use. You're gonna suffer, and you're gonna end up in a burnout,
100%.
some sort of a burnout. So either get a therapist, or if you have a good circle of friends, start sharing.
And
so
even
beautiful.
if it's like not your friends, right? Like, sometimes it can be really hard to do, and it's amazing that you're doing that, and I do that now a lot more. But even if you feel very scared about that, sometimes even speaking to someone you don't know as well, and just talking to them can also sometimes feel less scary, because you're like, well, they don't know as much about me, so I could probably tell them more than I could tell my friends. But you telling your friends, they probably feel like they know you more.
Absolutely.
They probably feel more connected to you, because you're showing a vulnerability side to yourself.
And the amount of laughs, you know, because like when you're real with people, like really deeply real, you're like, I'm telling you everything. It's just such a beautiful bonding experience. You talked about the importance of human connections. We don't want fake and authentic human connections. In order to have that deep level of connection, like I see you, I know you, I feel you, you got to be real with people. And challenging myself this year to do that, I feel a tremendous shift in the way I feel.
That's amazing.
And I'm, of course, very grateful for all my friends who are there for me. It's been quite a journey in a good way.
Right? And like all of that, like oxytocin and dopamine and norepinephrine and all of that kind of stuff that gets released because you are actually bonding in that moment. You get so much closer when you can heal with others.
Absolutely.
And it's so powerful. So yeah, as we both have just said, like human connection, speaking to someone is so important. The second thing I would say is actually, and it's really hard because sometimes these things sound very ordinary, but they had the biggest impact. And for me, it's about one of my biggest things, which is self-care. So I think all of us put ourselves last. I don't really know anyone who goes, oh, I always put myself first.
I think especially women. I think men struggle with this less.
I also think there's a lot of shame around it. So, you know, even this morning I said to you, you said, oh, you know, how was your morning? And I felt quite a lot of shame being like, I actually had a bath. And I had it because I had such bad menstrual pains. And I remember waking up and I was kind of shaking because I felt so de-energized. And I was like, oh, I'm really struggling today. And I thought, actually, I'm going to give myself like 10 minutes of time and put salts in a bath and give myself some time to actually feel that I can go through my day with energy. And go and get a coffee and a juice and some paracetamol and just have a bath and just have like 5 minutes to myself, which when you feel like you're go, can feel a lot of shame. But I'm now really put myself forward and going, for me to come to who I am, to every conversation as the best version of myself and that moment as much as I can be. What do I need? And I think fueling yourself with self-care is so important for your mental health. Because if you can look after yourself, then you can look after everything else in your life. And so many times you put everyone else before us. So I would say, like, just actually reflect if you're listening to this. I don't know what time of the day you might be listening to this or watching this, but say, what have I actually done for myself today? It doesn't have to be a big thing, but what I've done for myself today is actually recognize how I'm feeling and try to put in a boundary to make myself feel a little bit better in that moment, which is having a bath with magnesium to soothe my cramps and relax me because I felt a bit stressed. That's what I needed for my day.
That's it.
And so I think like having that time for that self-care is so important, but I honestly believe hardly anybody does it. And it's just because we don't feel important enough. So that's another thing. And if you can do that daily and just check in with yourself every day, you'll start to become more connected to yourself and not disconnected. And that's where kind of mental health problems really start. So that would be my number 2.
I love that.
And my number 3, it kind of connects to something I think I have to say because I am a nutritionist and I'm very passionate about food. But so much of our mental health is connected to what we eat. And I know that it's becoming much more of a topical conversation now around, you know, the interconnection between food and our mental health. And it's not the only thing, you know, exercise is really important, sleep is really important, the amount of daylight we're getting is really important, human connection, all of these things are massively important for our mental health. But so rarely do we look at the food that we eat. And I think if everybody actually wrote down in the day, how many plants did they consume? How much water did they consume? You know, did they drink that with tea and alcohol that can kind of inhibit micronutrients? All of these things are so important to our brain because our serotonin, our dopamine, predominantly is all made within our gut. And we know that people that suffer with IBS have a huge more of an impact of having mental health problems like depression. I think something like 80% are more likely to suffer with depression than people that don't have IBS. And that's all because of their gut. And so I would say, like, one of the biggest things is to look at your diet. Now, you haven't got to have a perfect diet, okay? We know, like, from studies, like, literally changing a couple of things, trying to just take out those ultra-processed foods. I mean, if you can just take out ultra-processed foods, you're already winning. That's, like, one of the biggest things, you know, like fizzy drinks, you know, all of those kind of fast food outlets. If we can just try and remove those, naturally you fill it with better things. So trying to consume more plants, oily fish. You don't need to go and buy loads of supplements. It's literally tiny steps. But I think sometimes when we live in manic lifestyles and we grab a sandwich on the way into work, we don't sit at a desk, we don't acknowledge what we're eating, we might not have drunk water for 3 hours. Like, all of these things over time really impact how we feel. And so what I always like to say is, like, try and look at your day, try and drink more water, try and add 1 to 2 new plant foods within your week, just within your week, things that you haven't tried before. Over a month, you've probably added 4 to 8 new plant-based foods. Over 12 months, that's a huge change. So really looking at, like, the quality of the food that you're eating. So those are the 3 things that I'd say that are really important for mental health prevention.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing everything you have shared today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I appreciate you putting yourself out there so vulnerably and sharing your story. I know in hopes to inspire so many people not to have to go through the same journey.
Yeah, that's, if this can kind of, like, touch just one person and get them to kind of become more connected to how they're feeling and not be afraid of it and to encourage to kind of look after themselves, and I think that's then that's my mission done.
I love it. I'm sure at one point we'll do a part 2. But where can people find you? I'm sure there's so many listeners and anybody who's watching this now who would love to find out more about what you do.
So lots of places. So if you go to my Instagram, Sarah Ann Macklin, that's where I'm active every day. Or you can go to my website also, which is Sarah Ann Macklin, where you can get, loads of guides on there and courses, and my newsletter, which you can sign up to on my website every week, which gives you your weekly dose of mental nourishment. And then if you want kind of community support as well, my not-for-profit organisation, the BY Collective, bycollective.co.uk or b_well_collective on Instagram, and you'll find a whole host of community and events and stuff on there as well.
Thank you again for being here today. I immensely appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you too, and thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.